Alrighty, so welcome to the Women's History Roundtable. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or evening, depending on where you're attending from. We're broadcasting, I think, on YouTube today, live stream straight to YouTube and on StreamYard. So if you have access to the StreamYard screen, you can see you can post a comment and questions. It should be on the right-hand side of your screen for any of our viewers out there. I am very excited for this roundtable today and to ask questions of these accomplished and insightful panelists. So before I introduce the panelists and begin with the questions, I'll briefly introduce myself and give a land acknowledgement, which are getting to be fairly standard in the Settler Colonial Society of Canada. So I want to start with that. So my name is Katelyn Arac. I'm going to be asking the questions today. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Wilfrid Laurier University in the Office of the Associate Vice President of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and I'm working on the Laurier Legacy Project, so looking into the historical legacy of Canadian Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier. So I'm hosting this discussion from the traditional territories of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The land is located on the Haldimand Tract and is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. So legacies of colonialism and resistance are part of this space. And I think it is imperative to reflect on how these legacies and structures are present in society, past and present. And now onto our roundtable today. So first I'm going to briefly introduce our four panelists. And then I'm going to jump into some questions I've prepared for them. And we'll conclude the roundtable with questions from you, the audience. So please, as we are going, please put any questions you have in the chat and we'll do our best to answer them. So our esteemed panelists today, I'm going to start with Johanna Strong. So Dr. Johanna Strong recently completed her PhD at the University of Winchester under the supervision of Dr. Ellie Whitaker and Dr. Simon Sandel. Her project, titled The Making of a Queen, The Effect of Religion, National Identity, and Gender on Mary I's Legacy in the English Historical Narrative, examined the way in which Mary I's legacy was posthumously created and how this legacy is perpetuated through to the period of the English Republic. Her research has been featured in 2 Winchester Heritage Open Days, Hampshire Hist Bites episodes on the Team Queens blog, with Tudor Dynasty, on the Tudor Society site, on Talking Tudors podcast, and most recently in a series for Winchester Cathedral. And I've caught a few of these, they're pretty great. Her first chapter was published in early 2002 in Valerie Schutt and Jessica Howard's Writing Mary I: History, Historiography, and Fiction. And if you'd like to follow her research, she can be found on Twitter and Instagram, and I'm sure she will share that in the comments in a bit. Carlie Visser is a 5th-year PhD candidate at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. She is an intellectual historian that focuses primarily on the history of American feminism and women's organizing in the 20th century. Carlie holds an honors degree from Acadia University, as well as a master's in political economy from Carleton University. Her current research examines the intellectual world of the Heterodoxy Club in Greenwich Village and their influence on American feminist thought. When not working on her dissertation, Carlie teaches a course on whiteness and race making in U.S. history. So jealous I didn't get to take this course. Works as a supervisor and lead instructor at her local climbing gym and attempts to train her 2 adorable dogs, Millie and Penny. Dr. Sarah Louise Miller, is a historian of war and conflict. She specializes in the Second World War and the use of military intelligence. She is currently a visiting scholar at the University of Oxford's Faculty of History and is a member of Kellogg College, Oxford. She is also a lecturer in the Defense Studies Department at King's College London. And Sarah received her PhD from the Department of War Studies, King's College London, in July 2022. Her thesis examined the work of women in the Allied naval services in British intelligence during the Second World War, focusing on the Battle of the Atlantic and the Pacific Naval War. She is an associate fellow of the Royal Historical Society, a member of the King's Intelligence and Security Group, and an associate of both the Lawton Naval History and Maritime Strategy Unit and the Freeman Air and Space Institute at King's College London. Sarah's the author of 3 books. My gosh, so impressive. The women behind the few, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force in British intelligence during the Second World War, women in Allied naval intelligence in the Second World War, a close secret, and Hawaii's Women at War. She also appears regularly on British television, having featured on various history documentaries for the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, and Sky History. Sarah is particularly interested in recovering the missing history of women in intelligence work, and that is something that is so important in the realm of military history. And finally, Mike O'Keefe. So Mike is completing his PhD at the University of Essex on a project titled Women's Working Lives in Merseyside, 1914 through 1929, Empowerment, Agency, Adaptability, and Resilience. So this is both a local study, but is also a reflection of the rest of the country in terms of employment opportunities created by war and the backlash that occurred with the peace that followed. His research centers on individual women's experiences at work. Mike's academic career started after he retired from a long career in the NHS, National Health Services Management, which covered the management of general hospitals, mental health services, NHS planning, and more across Essex. After retirement, Mike began his undergraduate studies in 2008 at Open University, and after a break in his studies due to his wife's illness, he completed his BA honors in history in 2017 and began his PhD in 2018 on a part-time basis. Mike's interest in women's history comes from two main sources. Firstly, a personal one, his mother. Her formal education in the early part of the 20th century was minimal, but she was an avid reader and became a foot care specialist and beautician. Later in her life, she became an expert in fine art and antiques. Secondly, Mike became fascinated by the struggles women faced in the 20th century as part of his final course with the Open University, which looked at this issue in the UK, France, and Germany. His non-historical interests include music. He used to play a bit of classical guitar, violin, and piano, and listens to music of all types. Mike also enjoys photography, cooking, reading, especially fantasy and crime literature, and art history. And now I think it's time to kind of jump into these questions and hear what each of these accomplished panelists has to say. So I want to begin with why you study women's history. Mike kind of talked a little bit of this in his bio, but what is it that really drew you to studying women's history?
Sorry, are you asking me?
I am asking any of you who want to jump in first.
Well, somebody else go first because you've already just read out my bit.
I am happy to get us started. I think the big reason why I am really interested in women's history and in gender history and how gender influences how we understand history today, but also historically the role that it has played, is because 50% basically of the population are women. 50% of the past, therefore, is women. But 50% of history isn't women. And I think the big thing that I was really interested in looking at who writes history is seeing why women predominantly are left out or are put in specific roles. And especially when I look at the history that I was interested in, we tend to put queens in the field of queenship studies. We tend to put queens as these extraordinary people, or they exist only as consorts, only as wives and mothers, and they're not kind of good in that interpretation for much else. And so I think it's so important kind of to put women more generally back in that story, and that we can't really tell history properly without acknowledging all of these complex factors. I think growing up obviously in a very strongly feminist household where it was very much don't let men write your story, is I think it's high time, and this is not against Mike, but it's against the historical men who went, we don't need women. I think it's time to be looking at history that women are incredibly significant, and that historical women are not extraordinary. they are kind of ordinary people. They are not to be put on a pedestal in that sense of the word extraordinary, but they are still incredible. So I think that's why I first got interested and why I do what I do.
I almost don't want to follow because that was so well put, Johanna. And I'm sure my answer will be a little less eloquent because I didn't intend to start like my career as a historian studying women. Like when I first went and did my undergrad in history, I anticipated studying like something to do with Irish nationalism. I was like really big into the history of like the 1916 Rising, and that was kind of where I had existed for a long time until the supervisor that I planned to work with for my honors went on sabbatical and all of her courses were taken off the calendar. So I had to find things to fill the slot. And what filled them were courses on American history with this professor, Michael Dennis, who has been like very formative in my like intellectual growth. And I did his course on American women in social reform, and we're introduced to all of these, like, as you say, incredible women who I had not encountered before in any kind of history, even though I knew the stories that they were a part of. And I knew vaguely about like the organizations they were connected to. I knew that suffrage was a major like historical turning point, but then like actually reading the women's stories and seeing how they work towards achieving their goals. And because I eventually come into the field of like feminist studies and feminist history, specifically looking at how they articulate different understandings of feminism and how they incorporate all of the like aspects of their identities and their lives into what they think that that should mean was really interesting to me, because it was so like at the time so different from what I had been led to believe like women's history was about. Like I was led to believe that it was about like the queens and like the exceptional ladies, and here I have like my exceptional ladies, but they're also everyday people, which yeah, they just like grabbed my attention and offered endless roads to go down, and I just stuck with it. And now I study like the exact women who first piqued my interest in women's history. Like I'm getting to do that project, so it's like a full circle thing for me.
I was pretty similar, Carlie. I literally said as an undergraduate, I will not do women's or gender history. And here we are, 3 books on women. And it was much for the same reason Johanna mentioned. I don't like it when there are unanswered questions. It just piqued my curiosity. And for me, it was about the fact that they were so missing from our narratives, especially of war. So I'm a war historian predominantly, and I kept looking at war, and I think Johanna said 50% of the population, roughly speaking. So where are they in the war history? They have to be somewhere because they did exist. So for me, it was about kind of excavating what wasn't there. And then I got into the kind of intelligence work as well, and Christopher Andrew, who kind of founded the field of intelligence history, says, we've got this missing dimension in war history where intelligence should be. We cannot understand the battlefield or the outcomes of military operations, if we don't understand intelligence. And inside of that missing dimension was another missing dimension. So the women are kind of this missing dimension within a missing dimension. And I just didn't want to leave them there. So I came across some really amazing stories and just couldn't stop, basically. And here we are today.
I'd just like to add a couple of more things, if I might, and just on that point that Sarah just mentioned about women in war. Of course, women were hugely important in the factories, particularly in in both world wars, and without them, it'd be interesting to know what outcomes would have happened. The other thing for me is women's representation in the arts, and in particular, the subject I probably know most about in the arts is music, And I bet none of you have heard of a woman composer called Lillian Elkington. Now, she was born in 1900, and when she was about 20 or 21, she composed a piece of music called Out of the Mist. It's only 8 minutes long, but it's an orchestral piece, a symphonic tone poem, in fact, and it's a reflection of the arrival of the unknown soldier from France to Westminster Abbey, and the day that the unknown soldiers, well, actually the 4 bodies came over and one was chosen, I think, or was it one body was chosen out of 4 in France? I can't quite remember which way round it was. And there was a mist on or fog in the channel that day, and hence the title when the ship arrived at Dover. But the important thing about this is that she wrote this when she was about 21, and it was performed once, I think. And then she got married at the age of 25, gave up her composing, and her compositions were then discovered in a brown piece of paper in a bookshop in 1970 after she died. And hence we start to know a little bit more about her. But she married a violinist in 1925 and effectively gave up her career. So for me, there are many examples like this. Florence Price is an American, African-American composer who a lot of people probably will not have heard of, but she was a huge influence as well. So anyway, that's another reason why I'm interested. And you can talk about fine art and Leonora Carrington and lots of female artists who aren't properly recognized.
I think it's so interesting to hear in such a diversity of fields that the 4 of you are in, right? Queen studies, kind of business history, military history, and intellectual history. There are all of these these gaps, right? And these gaps are left by the lives of everyday women who are part of history just as much as men are, and yet they get excluded from these narratives. So that it leaves, as I believe you said, Carlie, the unanswered questions, right? About why women, and the question I guess I want to ask about these unanswered questions, are why are these women excluded? And in the exclusion of women in your fields traditionally, how do you work to reintroduce them to these historical narratives? Especially Sarah and Carlie, you came at this never expecting to study women's history or gender studies. And we can talk more about the differences between the two later. But how do each of you work to reintroduce these kind of unanswered questions or these excluded women back into these histories, and especially in these fields you work in? Because I can't imagine in any of these fields it's particularly easy to be like, hey, rest of the field, guess what? Women too. So how do you kind of combat some of that? And how do you go about asking some of those questions? That was a lot of questions, sorry.
I think for me, it was about having to ask the question in the first place. Where are they? And I don't know if you've ever seen the memorial in London to women's work in the Second World War. It's quite controversial because there aren't actually any women on it. It's a series of like uniforms hung up on a monument, and it's supposed to sort of commemorate 17 different outfits that commemorate all the different kinds of work that they did. But there are no actual women in that monument. And literally across the road, you've got a proud statue of a military commander stood, really proud and in his uniform and everything. And it's very different how they were memorialized. And for me, it started with, well, why? Why are they not? Why don't we have these proud statues of them when we know that they were there? So for me, it was really difficult, like going to National Archives was not fruitful. I found plenty of files on, arguments over whether or not they should be allowed to wear trousers while climbing in and out of Spitfires to service them in the Second World War, because that's what the Air Ministry was concerned with keeping records of. What should they wear? How much operational time are we going to lose to menstrual cramps? They actually bothered to work that out in hours. But if you want to know, what did they do and what did it mean and what did they feel about what they were doing? So I've looked extensively at something called the kill chain, women kind of realizing that they bear responsibility, at least to some extent, for enemy deaths. You can't find that in the National Archives. So for me, it was about asking, okay, what were they doing? And what did it mean? And how can I find out about that? And the answer to that was, methodologically speaking, creatively, because it's not easy. And I'm sure Johanna and Mike and Carlie have had these issues as well. And I'm really interested to hear how you tackled it. But for me, it was about getting creative. What kind of sources are there then? There are gaps, there must be sources. And for me, that was a lot of oral history. I'm lucky because my period of history is, relatively speaking, not that long ago. So there are oral histories. There are some veterans still alive to interview. Newspaper archives, particularly out in Hawaii, because no one's paying attention in the Pacific theater of war to what women are doing, but the newspapers were. So lots of different kinds of sources, and having to think really outside of the box, methodologically speaking, to fill in the gaps that I had to work hard to highlight. And trying to highlight why should we care that women are missing in this way? Because they had an impact, a direct impact on military operations in the Second World War. So it's about asking the right questions of yourself as a researcher as well as of the field, and looking for the gaps in the literature and the narrative, and then getting creative with how we have to fill them.
Well, for me, and excuse my dog, I know she looks big, but she's still a puppy. So we're in, as I said, training mode, in case she makes any noises, like that one right there. But for me, I guess the way that I have kind of gone about it is I have started looking at sources that people have worked with before and like using the same materials, but especially in the field of like intellectual history, trying to take seriously the actual thoughts that the women are telling us they had through like their correspondence, through like pamphlets, through like even I'm writing a chapter right now that looks at their autobiography, which is of course a way, especially at the time I'm looking at, for them to kind of make this public claim to like a version of the self that they get to craft, but also to offer like a legitimate analysis of the world as they engage with it, which are often things that we don't really take too seriously when we're thinking in terms of like ideas and who gets to actually analyze the world. There's a wonderful quote, and I can never remember who said it or who I took it from, but it basically says like, it's really easy to found a school of thought when you have built-in disciples at an institution. So like if you are a professor that has like generations of grad students that are all there to back up your work and expand on your work, it's very easy to kind of, well, it's not easy, but it's easier to build that all-encompassing system of thought that then gets taken up and legitimized. But for women who aren't like historically haven't been given access to that level of power and don't have like the students to corroborate their work, or to carry their ideas beyond like the domestic sphere or like their select realms of like the public sphere, it's much harder for those ideas to kind of gain traction, to gain a following. So I have started looking at the writing of a lot of these women and kind of following suit with the trend in my field, at least within the last 10, 15-ish years, and trying to actually take seriously the thoughts of women, which should not be a novel idea, but apparently it is. And actually trusting them when they say that they believe that the connection between like economics and politics is a real thing and that they are actually qualified to speak on those issues. So really just the what should be a simple act of taking women seriously is how I go about a lot of my work.
Like Sarah, I'm relying on archived oral histories as well, although in the period I'm covering, unfortunately, there's nobody still around to interview directly. And for the First World War period, I have discovered a number of interviews that the BBC did for women who were involved in war work, if I can call it that, during the First World War from Liverpool itself, which was very useful. And some of those stories are quite powerful, particularly one who involved a woman who was married at the age of 16 and a half at the beginning of the 20th century. And by 1914 had had 6 children. And then in January that year, her husband died. He was the sole breadwinner, and therefore they're almost, they're on the breadline. They could have ended up in the workhouse, but there's no time to go into all the detail here now, but they didn't. And she ended up making shells in one of the munition factories during the First World War. And she was very efficient. So a very powerful story starts to emerge once you start looking at these individual histories. And there's another archive which I discovered where a number of women across Merseyside were interviewed. It was men and women, actually. It was a project aimed at memory more than anything. But in doing so, they talked about their lives and where they worked and so on. And so that's and I find that's why I put in my bio that, looking at individual voices is so powerful in terms of trying to grab hold of that hidden history that I think we're all saying that is important.
I'm about to come in and just ruin everyone's fun because I am very lucky because the woman I study is a queen. And so everyone is noticing what she's doing. Everyone is writing, this is what she's done. So I, thankfully, in some senses, don't have to read too hard against the grain, which is nice that you can go, and if you go to the British Library site and type in Mary I, you will find so many things with her signature on it. But the issue then that I had to confront when I was doing my thesis work was kind of Mary is very obvious when she's alive, and she's surprisingly obvious after she dies, but then she gets written out basically by secondary sources, and she kind of gets written out by the historians and by the people who are claiming to have authority over deciding who gets to write what and what makes it to be history and not just a thing that happened once ages ago. So I guess I won't waffle on too much. But just this, I get the blessing in a sense that I have lots of sources that I can wade through, but then needing to really challenge how they're interpreted. And I think the challenge that I have is not necessarily putting Mary back in the narrative. It's that I'm needing to actively break down what people already think. It's not that people just haven't thought about it. It's going, actually, you're wrong, here's why. And when you start with, you're wrong, here's why, people don't like that. And so I think I have very much profited or benefited, in a sense, from having one of these powerful, in a political structure speaking, powerful woman. But I think that is also very much to do with kind of building on this foundation from everyone else's fields to go, actually, what are queens doing? Because they're doing more than giving birth and marrying for alliances. And even if they don't marry or give birth for alliances, they're still incredibly important. But yeah, thankfully, I have sources, which is really nice.
I think it's so interesting to hear about the different methods you are each employing. And I think, Carlie, you mentioned kind of taking these women seriously. And I think that is something each of you kind of touch on, right? Like taking the women you're studying seriously in a way that traditional archives maybe don't always have. And even if they are in the archive, if that isn't an issue, then it's what are the secondary what are the secondary tellings of these individuals saying about them, right? Like Sarah, thinking about wearing pants or the amount of days off that menstruation is going to take is just something that is so weird to study. Like if you are in the middle of a war, that's what you're focused on. Really but trying to find
I want to know how many days women are entitled to for this, because I would like to apply this to all Department of Defense employees.
Exactly. And also, but I think in taking these sources seriously, but also asking questions of yourself, like you mentioned, Sarah, how does positionality affect the work you do, right? So Johanna, Sarah, Carlie, you are all women in your fields. You all are in fields that are often dominated by men. And Mike, in many ways, you have the opposite problem, right? You're a man studying women's history. So how does your own individual positionality affect both how you study what you're studying and kind of how you engage with that? That is a very big question. Sorry.
It's how to put this. It's been a challenge. I've worked in war studies and military history most of my academic life, and that is a male-dominated field. There is no beating around that bush. So for me, like I've been at academic conferences where I've been one of 3 women in a room full of 40 people, and someone will come up to you and say, "Oh, are you here with someone who's presenting?" And I'm like, "No, I am presenting." Like, it's tricky because people look at you and say, "What do you do?" And I say, "I'm a war historian," and they go, "No, you're not. You're how can you be?" Just by looking at you. Which I understand to some extent. And I like to think of myself as a bit of a disruptor in that way. But I think positionality is very, very important, actually, because there are so many reasons why women are missing from military and war history. That has to do with the fact that they are women. And here I am, a woman trying to kind of, excavate their history. And sometimes I have run into issues where people don't think that I have the right to do that because I'm a woman in a field of military and war history. So I've seen Twitter rows over whether or not women should do military history right after I've done some publicly, which is always funny, but not really when we really take that apart. So it is challenging, but I think also it does help in some ways because it fires you up to do it. First of all, I try and kind of lean on that rage, shall we call it, that comes from that kind of interaction. But it's also for me, like, it's a case of I'm not doing women's history, I'm doing history, and women belong in history. Like, there's no distinction for me. So I actually don't use that term most of the time when people say, "Oh, you're a gender historian, you're a women's historian." I say, "No, I'm not. I'm a war historian, and women were just as present in war as men. It's just we don't know that." So positionality in that way is critical. And I had this recently because my first book has just launched, and it's about women in the Royal Air Force in intelligence roles, and it's actually gone down quite well, which surprised me. That kind of outlook, when this is war history, we're not. If we keep separating it, it's perpetuating the separation and the kind of distinction. So for me, it's about unseparating it, putting it back together, and kind of being quite picky where I draw those lines, if that makes sense.
I guess I should come in, really, shouldn't I? And talk about this a little bit. So how can I, as a man, study women's history? Well, I very much like Sarah's comment about I'm studying history as much as anything else. And I suppose my position is that I'm empathetic, but also aware that I'm not a woman, obviously, and there are going to be some drawbacks as far as that is concerned. So I have to be aware of that. But the other thing is that all the secondary sources, or about 98% of the secondary sources, are written by women. I can only think of one man that's actually studied women's history. And if you belong to the Women's History Network, I think you can count on the fingers of one hand the number of men who are part of that network. So it is difficult personally, but I'm hoping my empathy will carry me through.
I think in a way, the fact that, I mean, as Sarah and Mike have said, that it is history. We just happen to focus on the women in it, and we happen to focus on these gendered aspects. But that it adds, at least in, I think, the public view, it adds a sort of legitimacy when there are not just one group of people who are focusing on a particular history. That I don't know how to put this politically correctly, but that it adds a sense of legitimacy that it's not just men talking about war history. It adds a legitimacy that it's not just women on a soapbox about women in history, that this is a genuine issue that we should be talking about. And that the fact that there are men who look at women in history, and there are women who are in traditionally male-dominated fields, I think is incredibly important, because it, in a sense, even though we all know kind of on the ground that it is legitimate history, I think it adds this public perception that, yes, we're not just angry about however many thousand years of female oppression. We actually have a reason, and a legitimate, valid reason for wanting to put women back in. Which I realize, as I say that, it sounds like we need men to validate women's history, which is not what I'm trying to say, but it kind of adds that element of, this is something that everyone should be dealing with, because it's not just up to women or to non-men to put women back into history. That this is something kind of we're all responsible for. And I was just looking at my bookshelf, and I am also very grateful to be in a field where I think one of the books that is kind of a foundational work is a single authored male historian. The rest are edited collections or monographs by female academics. And I think that's kind of when I was going through the list of who are the top 5 in my field, I think they're all women, which is, I think, really inspiring as a female academic, that, I don't, if and when I get married, I do not have to be like the musician who goes, well, I can't do anything now. And I can go, actually, I can have a life, and I don't have to drop everything, and I can put my career as being important. And I think that's one of the nice things about having a field, especially I think queenship studies, that is predominantly female, is that it gives that sense that I have every right to be here and to be the authority in the room. which I wish other fields had just as much.
I think I really love how you're all speaking about this issue. I think it's all very well put, and I think all I have to add is yes, I do history when I teach courses. I tell my students that they're learning about history. I don't tell them that it is like a specific area of women's history, or I build my syllabus based on what I know. But I will always, when I talk to my students or when I try to explain what I do, I will always immediately call myself a women's historian or a historian of women. And I think I really do attach a lot to that as kind of an identifying factor, just because of the kind of history I do, as a sense of, I guess, a connection to the political movement that we get women's history out of. Like, we get it not out of the good graces of the academy that suddenly decides that women are worth studying. We get it from centuries of women who have been writing history and doing history and telling women's stories. They just haven't been valued. But there's been historians of women way before the field existed. And their work is just as good as any history that's written alongside them. So I think I'd like to adopt it kind of in a nod to that historical lineage to it, but also in the recognition of, and I guess maybe this goes back to the positionality question as well, but as far as we've come in our respective fields, and when we think about the representation of women and how the fields are going, we're still not there. There's been great strides made for the area of women's history, for the understanding of women's history, but there are still departments that actively are cutting funding for gender studies and studies of women. There are disparities in who gets funding and who doesn't when we're talking externals. So it is great to see kind of the visual representation of it, but if we're looking at the institutional standing of women's history, I think it is very important to still kind of claim that label, at least for myself, to be I'm here, I do this explicitly, and it matters,
I think that one of the joys I have being a part-time academic, part-time teacher, is that I get to see pre-university students realizing that history is not just old, dead white men. And I think kind of what sums this up is I had a year 9, so kind of grade 9, 13-year-old girl come up to me after one of our lessons. We are currently doing the First World War, and she's very over it already. And we're only about 2 weeks in. And she goes, "Miss, why can't we talk about women more? How come it's always wars?" Well, because they're very important and they change a lot of things about the world. She goes, "Yeah, but Malala getting shot in the head is maybe just as important." Okay, you're not wrong. But fair point. Why are we centering basically every curriculum that I teach? Why is it based on kind of, we go from a war to a war to a war? Not saying it's not important, but that there's stuff that happens in between, and there are consequences that happen off the battlefield, and there are events that happen off the battlefield that are equally important. And it was one of those moments of just, oh, she's 13 and she's already realizing that this is how history is being presented. And it's that moment of I've done it wrong if this is how she's seeing it. But it is very much this kind of, we have to carve out that space where women in history are legitimate and valued. I think, yeah, as Carlie says, putting a label on it adds kind of that legitimacy and the nod that someone didn't just wake up yesterday and go, "We should do women's history." It's people who just finally listened to the thousands of years of going, "Yeah, we need this."
There's definitely a tension there, isn't there? There's a tension between we can't keep separating it because it perpetuates the separation, but we have to separate it in some ways. It's so hard. It's one of the big challenges of studying women in history.
And I think it's also so interesting to think about how we bridge these divides, right? Whether that is centering women in these different fields, or whether that is who studies what even, and who frankly gets a place at the table in the field of history, right? Like, I was thinking, Johanna, as you were talking about your bookshelf, I look at mine behind me and I do political history and immigration history. And in immigration history, there's a lot of representation for female academics, a lot less so in academic history, right? So who studies what kind of history is also a part of this discussion. And I think an interesting one to have. I do want to jump ahead a little bit, since you've mentioned kind of why history is important to us today, to ask that question. So why do you think women's history is important for us to study today? And why do you think it is important for us to position women's history today? Carlie, you definitely already talked about this, which is why I'm asking the question now, a little bit in afterthought. And then what are some of the walls and stereotypes that we still need to break down in studying women's history, and incorporating female voices into history kind of more broadly?
I'm going to jump on this one because I literally talked to my students about this the other day. Because of course, like the issue that you kind of have at the undergraduate level is trying to make folks see value in the degree, right? Especially when you have like all of the talking heads that say history is like a worthless major and all of that, convincing people otherwise. So a few weeks ago in my course, like we had a conversation about why kind of studying history is important, but especially women's history, in the context of the reversal of Roe v. Wade in the States. And I asked my students, I was like, did any of you actually read the brief? Like, did any of you read the decision? And none of them had, but they had their information from like TikTok and news outlets and all of this. I'm like, go read it. Like, it is all a misuse of history, but it is history that is being used to back a legal decision. And it is a certain interpretation of women's history that's being used to overturn Roe v. Wade and limit access to like abortion rights. So it's like this stuff happens all of the time in like law, in politics, in like you can break it down into like pop culture, what have you. Like there is a history behind everything. I have a student who one of my students is writing their historicizing the headlines assignment on the like prevalence of blackface on college campuses, or trying to contextualize like the violence experienced by Black women in like the cultural scene. And all of this is trying to make them see like the value in what they're doing, in recognizing that we can understand things that are happening today through their connection to the past, and how we choose to interpret that or who we choose to value in the past is super, super important.
And the pupper agrees. I think like Carlie's touched on those big things. Of my immediate thought of why is women's history important, because I'm still paid 73, 76, whatever the official stat is on the dollar, because I'm still expected as the woman to be the one who takes care of kids, because I'm still expected that, you know, I will follow a spouse somewhere, because I'm still expected to play these gendered roles that don't necessarily fit in 2023. And I think we need women's history to say, like, look, women do a lot more than get pregnant, give birth, and then do it again. That women have significant roles, and women incredibly influence how the world is today. And I think what's so important about why we need to kind of getting on the soapbox, why we need to put this into schools, and we need to put this as maybe not a mandatory module, but the one where, you know, you have to take a Canadian history at Queen's in undergrad in order to graduate. Maybe we need to do that for gender history or something, a topic of women in history, because we had obviously International Women's Day recently, and I wore my fantastic shirt that I'm wearing today, but you can't see it because I'm short. But it basically has all of these adjectives for women, and the bottom one is history maker. And my students looked at it and went, yeah, but if I wore that said men are history makers, I wouldn't be allowed to. But yeah, but when is International Men's Day? Like, this isn't about you today. Stop making it about you today. But it's just this sense that there's almost that knee-jerk reaction from some people of, well, how come they get their own history? Where's our equivalent of history? And you go, well, you have the other 364 or 5 days. But I think that's why it's so incredibly important, is because you wouldn't have history without the women. And it's not kind of right to not highlight that. And I think even it's one of those where leaving it out is fine, but purposefully leaving it out is even worse, of knowing there is this entire field out there and choosing not to include female academics on syllabi, choosing not to engage with what women are doing during world wars. And I think that's kind of the big thing for me for why it's still important, is because we still have all of these issues that stem from kind of outdated gendered expectations, or expectations that we just assume are still valid, and some may be and some may not be, but that we just accept them because that's how it's always been done. So I think that's the big thing for why it's still relevant, is because we unfortunately live in a world where we have to, as we were saying, that tension between, do we separate women's history from history? And we unfortunately live in a world where we have to have that separation in order to have it included. Yeah, I'm sure that was not a very uplifting answer.
I just think we, just to add to some of the things there, just thinking about legal rights of women over time, and how difficult it has been, you know, women not being able to have their own bank accounts up until relatively recently. In France, for example, women didn't get the vote until 1944. So much later. And then issues around contraception and men having to give permission for the women to take the contraceptive pill. And so if we look at all those things, so well, they're all in the past, but actually once you start looking at the level of discrimination even today, and we've had a report in recent days about police in the UK, and the misogyny going on within the police, and how can we trust the police, and so on, and particularly in terms of sexual assaults and violence against women. So there's a whole range of issues that are still valid today that come from the past, that we need to help people understand where we've come from, but how much more there is still to do.
Exactly, Mike. I have this all the time when people say to me, oh, but there's been so much progress. One of the things I get asked about the most is legacy. So what's the legacy of women serving in the military in the Second World War? And connecting it to the legacy from the First World War and things like that. And it's actually just an illusion a lot of the time. I always use that word, the illusion of progress, because, you know, we can trace the equalities of women in the military today to the work that they did in the Second World War, and there is legacy there, but it's not finished. There is still so much work to be done. And if you like Mike was just saying about the police, if you turn the news on every other week, there's a report about sexual assault or harassment in the military services in the UK and in the US. and I'm sure in lots of other countries. And it's not finished. It's not a finished journey. The intelligence and espionage, 24% of MI6 in 2018, 24% of the higher ranking officers were female. You know, we still have issues also with the LGBTQ plus community in espionage and intelligence, and GCHQ have been vocal about that recently. It's not finished. There is still a huge amount of work to be done, and if we don't have that historical knowledge, how are we going to do it? So it is about legacy, but we can't be idealistic about that and say everything's better now. Look how far we've come. We may have come a long way, but we are not finished, and we have a long way yet to go. And history is how we complete that journey, or how we at least try, because we know what needs to be fixed, and we can see what did and did not work in that process.
I think on top of, obviously, Sarah's just got a new book out, which is very exciting. I was sad to not be able to make it, but was following along on Instagram for all of the excitement. I think it's one of those, especially on the military side, because anything military that I look at is 500 years old. And it is I was going to say out of necessity. It's not even just men going to war, because we have people like Isabel of Castile. But I hadn't realized, even though I was kind of so interested in women's history, of just how recent these issues still are. And so, obviously, highlighting the published research that Sarah's got out, but it also makes me think of, in my master's, I was doing the degree at the same time as, I've just blanked on her name, as Charlotte Duval-Lantoine. And she's just come out with a book called The Ones We Let Down. And it's basically about, until the early 2000s, I think it might go until the 2010s, talking about how women were integrated into the Canadian Armed Forces, and just how resistant in the 2000s people were, and the military was, to this. And to think like this, I mean, as Sarah said, this is an issue today. And historically, it's not a new issue. We're just seeing it more obviously. Yeah.
It is interesting and heartening and disheartening, I suppose, to see how history can be so cyclical, right? These issues come around so often, time and time again, and how history keeps repeating itself generationally. I know I taught a course in women's and gender studies at Queen's a few years ago, and I faced some of the same questions, Johanna, you mentioned your students asking, in that, okay, we're talking about women's history, but where are men situated in this? And when I teach Canadian history, it's, okay, we talked about this week, we did Black history this week. What about this group or that group? And the only thing I can ever tell them is, we can stop individually talking about these groups if they actually have a real voice in the broader conversations of history. And until then, they get their own voice and their own day and their own week and their own modules, because until they are as included in our study of like overarching broad narratives of history, until they are as included in that, they get kind of special treatment, because so often their voices are ignored, their voices aren't heard. So often they're read out of the narrative, read out of the history. So, and I love that you guys in all of your fields kind of talked about how we go about doing that.
And as my mom said, when Carlie's mentioned Roe v. Wade was overturned, my mom's comment on it, apart from all of the obvious, this is awful, was, my generation's already had this fight. Like, why is your generation needing to do it again? Like, pick, in a good sense, pick new battles. Don't refight the battles that we've already had. And just the way that society has made it that these are the same issues that are happening again and again is disheartening, I think. But it, at least for me, is that motivation of, we have to keep doing what we do and kind of yell louder of what we do, because hopefully the next generation won't have to have these same fights, and those students won't be saying, yeah, but what about the men?
It's great that we have International Women's Day, but one of my main hopes for the future is that we don't need it anymore. And I try and take that into my work. I'm working toward hopefully one day not needing International Women's Day.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things too with doing women's history, and people will often kind of see it as a niche area or a specialized area, but in a lot of ways, like when you do women's history, you don't have, I'm going to call it a privilege, but like the same privilege as doing men's history, or history broadly speaking, where you can operate under the illusion that the men that you're studying are the only people who matter and the only people who have done things, and they're engaging with systems that they created. When you do women's history, you have to engage with men. You have to engage with the broader power structures that often these women are not in like control of structuring. So in many ways, like you get almost a more holistic look at history and kind of what is included and what is excluded from the history you choose to do, because you have to engage with the power structures that other folks have the privilege of kind of overlooking or saying that that's not really their concern, where it needs to be your concern in women's history.
Yeah, I just want to add that in my my studies, all the men are in charge of all the employment that I'm looking at from 1914 to the end of the 1920s. So that's an issue. Just wanted to say to Sarah as well, the BBC interviewed the women from Liverpool who worked during the First World War. One of his standard questions was, did they wear trousers?
It never
Pressing issue.
the trousers question all the time.
I thought you'd appreciate that.
So I want to see if anyone from the audience does have any comments, like I have said at the beginning of this chat, please post them in the chat. I'm just going to give the audience a few minutes to do that. And I'm out of questions. Thank you all panelists for answering all of the questions so insightfully. Oh my gosh, I've learned so much today, and I cannot wait to rewatch this to think further about things. I'll probably be following up with emails for all of you. But on that note, I wanted to give you guys a space just for a few minutes before we wrap up to kind of any final thoughts on women's history or what you study, or anything like that, or questions you have of each other.
I have a question, and I'm interested. This might be a bit more difficult for Johanna, seeing as your period is such a long time ago. But I wanted to ask, particularly Mike, do you think that historians have been a bit more wary of the kinds of sources we use than they necessarily should have been? Because something I've been coming across lately has been this traditional wariness of oral history because of stuff like the impact of time on the memory, and stuff like that. But I often find that it's a bit hypocritical in a way, because you've got this issue with Bomber Command where their operations have been a bit kind of controversial. But in that debate, you're kind of imposing today's moral outlook on a historic operation in a very different time, in a very different context. So I sometimes feel like we're a bit picky when we brand different sorts of sources useful or not useful. And I'm interested to see if you're as wary of those kinds of sources as a lot of people are, because I'm increasingly less wary.
Yeah, I am aware of that the time at the interview is critical in terms of people recalling events of the time of the interview with the events that they're trying to remember, and that's a problem that has to be recognized. But for me, what's comes through more than anything is the power of the individual voice. And for most of the women I'm studying, they didn't write things down. there are very few lessers around. There's one autobiography that I've come across of a woman reflecting on her life back. It's called A Backward Glance on Merseyside, or something like that, and which was published in 1948. But they're very few and far between in terms of. So if you're trying to, for me, trying to understand what it was like for women to actually work, you've got all the statistics, and you can go on and talk about, well, women were limited to this type of occupation or that type of work, but you can plow through all of that, and you can come to the conclusion it wasn't brilliant. But for a lot of the women that have talked about their lives, a lot of them actually enjoyed the work that they did. Mm-hmm. And that really doesn't come through in a lot of the secondary sources, I don't think. And the interplay that was going on between them and men. I'll just give a brief example of women. There was a textile. There was a factory in Birkenhead, operated from 1908 to 1970, called Lee's Tapestry Works. And these women weavers got paid more than the men in the dye house. And the men started to complain. I mean, the women were much more highly skilled, of course, doing what they were doing. So the management said to the men, well, if you want to train to be a weaver, then we will increase your pay. But none of them did. It was just a question of them receiving less remuneration than these skilled women. And one of the women who talks about this in a little bit of detail, she says that, well, they never wanted to do it anyway. They were just yellow bellies, basically. And I just thought that's, you're not going to get that kind of comment other than in something like oral history.
It's that subjectivity, isn't it? It's something we
absolutely
kind of roundtable on that alone, on subjectivity in history, because we don't get the kind of information in the official records that we get on men, but we do get this lovely subjectivity with the kinds of records that we are forced to use in this subject.
Mm-hmm. I think I was going to say, and then I absolutely want to talk about Jen's comment. This idea, and I think I'm about to blow everyone's mind. I think obviously I don't do oral histories because apparently using Ouija boards is not a legitimate way to contact people. But kind of my entire project was looking at how people remembered Mary. And so somehow when it's an oral history and it is a spoken history, we question that memory when we shouldn't, because all history is biased. But somehow, when people read a source from 1659 talking about Mary in 1553, that's somehow not at all about memory, and it's fine because I'm sure it's correct. But it's this whole kind of why, when it's written down, is it more acceptable to be remembering something that you didn't even live through? But when it's an oral history, there's somehow this haziness about it. And I think that's, again, one of these other things that we need to be talking about kind of as a public-facing field is oral histories are equally valid, because a textual source has all of the same issues, just written down and not recorded on a recording device.
Yeah, I think too, when we think of like the issue of memory in the sources that we use, at least for me, when I'm writing and trying to be more of an intellectual historian, to me, and the way that I've structured my dissertation, I almost don't care if the memory is correct or accurate or not, because the way that I'm using it in this case is, whether it's correct or not, whether their memory has faded or not, the version that they are telling me, they believe to be true. And if it is something, so when I'm looking at their sense of self and their subjective experience of the world, if they see that as being influential to how they then engage with the world around them, I'm going to take them at their word. Even if their friend will say, no, that never happened, that's somebody else's story, right? So one of the things that I am trying to do, because when I study the Heterodoxy Club, there's not a lot written on it, but there's a fair bit. But what they often do is position the women as kind of in their own like silos. Like they all engage in peace work or suffrage work, or they're involved with the labor movement, and they exist all by themselves. And throughout history, they are known women, but they exist by themselves. But they've been getting brunch together every other Saturday for 25 years. Like all of these women, to use a modern word, were besties. Like they were good friends. And there's nobody that's going to tell me that that level of friendship didn't have some kind of influence on how they were thinking, how they were engaging in their work. So taking those like friendship memories almost that I see like in their letters or in their autobiographies and how they choose to represent themselves, but also the women that they're spending so much time with. I don't care if it's true or not. That's how they wanted it to be seen, and that's how it mattered to them. So I'm going to take them at their word for that.
I think it is so important. I agree with what all of you said, to think about the ways in which sources are understood, and the way in which sources are constructed, right? Whether that is an oral history, and who is giving the testimony in an oral history matters greatly on the validity of the source, right? So how you're conducting those interviews. I know in Canada, I assume UK has this as well. There's GREB processes before you can interview people, so that you are following the ethics of interviewing, hence the no Ouija boards.
I have ethics, and my people are so dead.
Yes.
I had to fill out an ethics form.
There are these things that are built into how we study history to kind of try and balance some of these things, but they don't take into account necessarily the ways in which an individual's life experiences do influence how they think, how they write, all of these things, right? So that can change the sources themselves. And I think you guys summarized that quite interestingly. I do want to quickly go to Jem's point. Jem said she wanted to say that queer and trans women are important in considering histories too, especially as they've forgotten. And I wanted to know, if you don't, that is fine, but if you guys could say a word or two of, if you think about the ways in which other identities besides just the binary of male, female is included in these histories, and maybe how women's history / transitioning into gender history is kind of trying to answer some of these questions about inclusivity or exclusivity.
One of the big things, I guess I should say, it's lovely to see Jem. They are one of my students, normally on Tuesdays for university lectures. One of the good ones coming through. It's very exciting to see. I think one of the big things that I've kind of out of necessity had to define in basically everything where I use the term gender, because that is such an anachronistic word for the early modern world, because there is no such thing as gender. If you are born with female reproductive organs, you are a woman. Therefore, these are what you were expected to do in life. And so this concept of biological sex and gender are just one thing. And this idea that you can separate them and go, yeah, this is what I physically have, but this is how I see myself, or this is the role I have in society. Having those separated is something so foreign to the early modern mind. And I think that a really big thing that especially early modern history has to tackle is, of course, even though we don't in the early modern world have terms for trans or gay or queer or kind of anything else that is non-heterosexual, it doesn't mean that that's not who people are. It just means that there's not a word for it, and that is an aspect of identity that is not allowed to be publicly presented in some ways. And I think when we talk about gender history, what is so important is that when we're talking about gender, we're also talking about how men are expected to be, that men are expected to be kind of the strong savior of the damsel in distress. They're supposed to make money for their family. They're supposed to have a wife and kids. They're supposed to be doing X, Y, Z. And so, kind of as Jem and Katie, you've pointed out this idea that there is not in 2023 a binary anymore. And well, I shouldn't say anymore. I don't think there ever was in reality, but we've constructed it as this binary. And what happens then is we sometimes lose people through the cracks. And it's when we look at kind of gender history and how women get the vote, and we get kind of universal male suffrage, and then white women go, I'm sorry, I'm a white woman. A black man has the vote, but a white woman doesn't, and they get upset because there's this almost hierarchical order in their mind of, well, I'm white, so even though I'm a woman, I come above everyone else. And I think that's kind of almost the sense that when we look at women's suffrage, we can't just look at what their sex is or what their gender is. We have to look at all of these other intersections. And I think that's so true. Obviously, I speak as a cis het woman, and others can probably speak better to this. But I think it's one where we have to look at who is still falling through the cracks and why, and is having this binary of saying, well, you're either this or that. Is that the best way to approach this? And that there are so many different aspects that kind of feed onto each other and are influenced by each other that affect how people are included in history and why and to what extent. That was a very long, rambly answer.
I like that, Johanna. That was good. I liked your use of intersectional. I'm actually a really big supporter of intersectional approaches and interdisciplinary even. And I've been quite frustrated on this issue. And in general, actually, with the way in which methodology and approaches can actually sometimes be quite restrictive. And my PhD supervisor pointed out to me a few times that he felt I was becoming obsessive with this issue because, every time he would, so I made the decision to try not to use or lean on social and cultural approaches, because when you study women in war, that's what had kind of always been done. And I wanted to look at sort of battlefield implications of women's work. So I wanted to use military history approaches. And I banged that drum all day long, and my PhD supervisor was like, just calm down. And then I realized in the women's military forces in the Second World War, and probably in the First as well, you do have this recurring issue of how homosexuality is viewed, lesbianism in the women's military. And I was always quite frustrated with the way in which gender history or women's history approaches could actually be restrictive in how we looked at that. And so I thought it was quite interesting when you start using things like sociology and even social anthropology and different kinds of psychology, different kinds of approaches and methodologies, is actually a way to crack that nut wide open. And I really enjoyed doing that with various aspects of looking at women in the Second World War. And I think that, queer and trans history is something that really could benefit from that kind of approach. So it's just a personal opinion. I'm interested to see what everybody else thinks on that front.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, Carlie.
Go ahead,
do you want
Mike.
to go first?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Just reflecting on what Sarah was saying about how restrictive studying can be, and certainly for PhD studies, you can be quite limited in what you can approach. The other thing, of course, is sources. as well, and a lack of them in terms of looking at homosexuality, lesbianism, or trans subjects. So that's a real difficulty for me personally in the period that I'm covering. But one of the things I wanted to try and bring in was race, particularly in Liverpool, because Liverpool at the turn of the 20th century was right hodgepodge, cosmopolitan city, because of and a very transient population, up to 20,000 people at any one time, temporarily living in the city, with sailors coming and going and so on and so forth, and a lot of African sailors, Chinese sailors. Liverpool has the oldest Chinese community in the UK, but trying to get information about all of this, and particularly women who were part of those communities. Interestingly, as far as African, the African influx, if you like, into the city, it was mainly men because they were sailors. But Liverpool, or some historians also boast that Liverpool has the longest black community in the UK as well. And that dates back to Liverpool's slave trade in the 18th century, when Liverpool was really the capital of the slave trade itself. And something like 1.5 million people were shipped from Africa in Liverpool ships. So huge. And some people from Africa were actually brought back to Liverpool and sold in Liverpool, not necessarily as slaves, but as servants. I really would have liked to have included some of that, but such as I might, there's very, very limited sources on that.
I think I'm not cutting Carlie off. I want to say this in case she has anything to respond to this as well, is Mike mentioning that the way that we see communities who are seen as non-conforming is we often, in textual sources, we have to base our knowledge on court cases of when this non-conforming is brought to trial. And I was just looking on my bookshelf, and I don't know where it's gone, unless it's directly behind me and I can't turn that far. But Susanna Lipscomb's Voices of Neem is a hefty volume, but it is women's voices exclusively told through court records, because that is one of the only ways to get the average woman's voice into the public, was when she had to, unfortunately, in a lot of these women's cases, when they had to testify in sexual assault cases, either against themselves or servants. But just this idea that there's a different set of sources that we often have to rely on, that makes it, I think, even more restrictive in trying to see this fuller picture. Oh, now let Carlie share profound wisdom.
Well, I don't know how profound it's going to be. But I was just thinking, and again, like Sarah, like you were saying, during your PhD, you became obsessive over using certain approaches. And I'd say I probably border on the same thing in just obsessing over the idea of taking women seriously. Like I've really, really pounded that into my dissertation. But one of the ways that is going to come up in my dissertation, but also in the field like itself, is taking seriously the ways that they are thinking about their sexual or their gender identity, right? So you do have cases, Penny, stop. You do have cases where you get folks who are historically identified as women telling you in their sources that they are not women. You do have cases where they say, I am a man in the body of a woman. Perhaps like one of the most notable recently being like Polly Murray, the civil rights activist from the US, who only like recently within the historiography have folks started to try and work at the history of, are they a trans man or are they not, based on the sources that Murray left, which very clearly state a like discomfort in the body that they were born in feelings of more like attraction to women, of feelings of masculinity, and really expressing the sense that they are not in a body that corresponds to how they think of themselves. So taking seriously the ways that they are articulating their own gender identity, even before the concept of gender is a thing. Sorry, Penny's been trapped in this room for a long time. But seeing it as a legitimate explanation of how they feel, as opposed to this is just like a woman wishing to be part of the man's world, or like a woman expressing like same-sex desire, but in the language of the time, right? Penny, I'm almost done, I promise. But yes, and kind of building on, Mike, what you were saying, I was actually talking to my students about this today. It was our intersectionality week. But we looked explicitly at the overlap in the discourses of like race and sexuality, and how at the start of the 20th century, they often overlap and influence one another. But looking at those connections and like the intersecting like axes of oppression, or the various ways that power operates, and understanding how that shapes an individual identity, I think can only like enrich, even if you're doing like an individual history, or being explicit about the kind of women's history you're doing. So if you're studying white women exclusively, like what does that say about the kind of history you have access to and the narratives that you can tell? The same way as you are studying any kind of like ethnic history or otherwise like racialized history. Not to say that white women are not also racialized, because they are. But, yes. Okay, sorry.
I think
Penny's
we'll
so angry that we are still needing to talk about this and that the world just isn't solved.
I was going to say, I think we'll take our cue from Penny, because we could definitely continue this conversation for like 3 more hours. There's so much more to say. But I think ending with intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw, look her up if any of our viewers are interested. It is mind-blowing work. But we will end
also
there.
got
And
a
I
great
want to
podcast, Intersectionality Matters, goes weekly. It's great.
Yes, thank you. And I want to, as we wrap up, I want to thank all of you panelists for your insights today. I really enjoyed listening to what you had to say, and hearing your kind of thoughts and perspectives in women's history in particular, and how you study it. I think we can only learn so much. There we go. I unmuted myself. And I really want to thank all of you who attended this roundtable as well, for all of our viewers, past and present, future, for those who are going to watch it in the future. I really hope you enjoyed it. There are some really interesting talks lined up for history indoors in the future, and they can be found at our website, which I am just posting. There we go. So please join us for those, including Mike will be giving one in a few weeks on code breaking and warfare. And all of the details on our talks past and future are on the website or on YouTube. So thank you, and we hope you enjoyed this talk, and continue to enjoy the history talks. So have a good one.